Well, good morning, everyone. And I'm Chair. My name is Shinsuke Tomotsugu, coming from Hiroshima University. And shall we begin now? First of all, I would like to introduce the speakers, all of you. The first speaker is Anna-Mart van Wyk. She's talking about South Africa and the NPT. And the second speaker will be Moeser. He's discussing the unlikely supporters of non-proliferation about South Africa's impact on the NPT and Africa-wide nuclear weapons free zone, 1988 to 1991. And last speaker, welcome back, Hassan Elbahtimy. He's talking about the Egypt, NAM and NPT. Okay, and then after the presentation by them, we asked Marvin or Driscoll, he's now coming, to be our discussant. All right, shall we begin with the Anna-Mart van Wyk, please.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Okay, so South Africa is a very curious case. Whenever you start talking about the global nuclear order, non-proliferation, non-alignment, and that sort of thing. For those in the audience who don't know, is that South Africa was one of those peculiar states who played a cat and mouse game with the NPT, or with alignment. And I will go into more detail about the early phases of the South African program and when the NPT opened up for signature, where South Africa was standing in terms of their approach to the NPT. And then Robin will take off with where South Africa then, in the end, in 1991, signed the NPT. South Africa developed 6.5 nuclear weapons over a space of about 15 years in the late 1970s and in the 1980s. And it became the first state in the world that unilaterally then dismantled their small nuclear arsenal. The official records indicate that South Africa, the 6.5 bombs, and everybody asking about the half. Okay, the half is basically enough fissile materials, for another bomb. The 6 devices were Hiroshima-type devices, so between 15 and 16 kilotons. But South Africa also did make quite a lot of progress towards the end of the 1980s with research into thermonuclear weapons and also miniaturizing their warheads to be fitted on missiles. So just as a departing point, know that South Africa was a nuclear weapon state that was non-aligned to the NPT for most of the 70s and the 80s. But let me start with the original history around that. So William Walker writes that after Hiroshima, the persistent question was how far, if at all, the state system would have to be modified if humankind were to avoid the cataclysm of nuclear war. So some of the proposed solutions at that point was to replace the state system with a unitary system overseen by a world government that would then end the competition that drove organized warfare. In terms of nuclear technology and materials, there were some suggestions that those types of technology and materials had to be placed under a special form of global governance to put it beyond the reach of individual states. So the order that eventually then emerged was basically a confluence of these proposals. Basically, it came to the point where the great powers would practice nuclear deterrence that would offer their allies protection, while also retaining the freedom and granting themselves the legal rights to develop and deploy the nuclear forces as they saw fit. Just as a note, not all of my slides are up there, so this slide is too quick for whoever. I'm not sure why it's running through, but it's not supposed to. Okay, it's supposed to be there still. Okay. All right, so it's there. Okay, wonder what's happening. Can we just pause it there somehow?
Sorry.
Because those that are shaded out are actually my own notes that, not supposed to be showing. Okay, leave it there for the moment. Can we pause it there? Okay. So I'm building up to this point of what Joseph and I said. But just to recap then, in contrast then, just to go back, that the confluence of the above proposals was that the great powers would practice nuclear deterrence, that they would offer allies protection, while at the same time retaining their freedom and granting themselves the legal right to develop and deploy nuclear forces as they saw fit. And this was confirmed by the NPT, that the 5 nuclear weapon states by 1970 had exactly these rights, and everybody else that was outside of the NPT could not basically then use the same approach. And South Africa became one of those states that thought this managed system of deterrence and abstinence was inherently discriminatory, and it was robbing states of the protection of deterrence as offered to the 5 nuclear weapon states under the NPT. So this begged the question, was it a case of a revolt of the dispossessed? Was the fact that South Africa developed nuclear weapons then a revolt, because it was one of the dispossessed nations? Or was it something else that drove the South African program? Okay, so prior to the NPT opening for, just leave it there, okay? So prior to the NPT opening for signature, South Africa complied with early international non-proliferation norms and supported the emergence of a global non-proliferation order. And this was exemplified by its support of and becoming a founding member of the IAEA in 1957. But by 1964, when the negotiations for a non-proliferation treaty started, South African Prime Minister Hendrik Verwoerd decided against South African participation due to increasing international condemnation and isolation of South Africa. Now, we don't have time today to go into the reasons why South Africa was isolated, but it was a time that the ANC and the PAC were banned from South Africa. South Africa faced a court case at the International Court of Justice because of its occupation of Namibia, and so on and so forth. Verwoerd at that point also wanted to keep South Africa's options open due to a perception that hostile African nations may acquire nuclear weapons. And it was particularly the African nations that were very vocal against the South African apartheid policy in the United Nations at that stage. So for them it was kind of like this perceived threat that might arise from the African states. So by 1965, South Africa then voted in the UN General Assembly for a draft resolution that was submitted by the 8 non-aligned nations of the 18-nation Disarmament Committee. This resolution urged all states to take all steps necessary for an early conclusion of a treaty preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The South African delegation noted that they voted for the resolution because it was entirely within their basic approach to the question of disarmament. Okay, so 1968, that is where the negotiations for the NPT were still ongoing, and South Africa voiced support for a UN General Assembly resolution on a treaty preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. In the meantime, okay, going back to the South African program, by the time that the NPT opened for signature, South Africa was 8 years into a nuclear research and development program. Basically this program would look at the development of nuclear power. It prioritized the implementation of nuclear power in South Africa, but by 1968-69, South Africa was also very much interested in developing a PNE, a peaceful nuclear explosive. So they wanted to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and the PNE for basically deep mining and that sort of thing. So instead of signing the NPT in 1968, South African Prime Minister John Foster announced the launch of a new uranium enrichment process, which also tells you that by 1970 South Africa was, very much thinking about a nuclear explosive capability. Now, the launch of that uranium enrichment process raised the proverbial eyebrow, because it was widely believed that up to that point, the ability to enrich uranium for nuclear weapons or nuclear power was limited to the 5 nuclear weapon states. So when pressurized by the IAEA in 1970 over South Africa's reluctance to sign the NPT, Foster explained that Pretoria was reluctant to surrender, almost irrevocably, long-held sovereign rights without having precise details of the implications, and that's a quote. So this basically became South Africa's mantra until it finally ratified the NPT in 1991. This also meant that the Safari 1 reactor that South Africa got from the United States in the 1960s, the research quantities of HEU to be used in that research reactor, and the future nuclear power reactors that were to be installed north of Cape Town would be covered by IAEA inspections and safeguards. None of the other facilities, the enrichment facility and the later facility that was built in the 1980s, none of those were under IAEA safeguards or inspections. Okay, so now we get to Joseph Nye. So Joseph Nye argues the following, that South Africa, along with a handful of major nuclear threshold countries, rejected the NPT because they considered it discriminatory and hypocritical for the superpowers to maintain weapons denied to other states. Basically, South Africa is saying, it's not right that you have the right to develop nuclear weapons and we don't, because we might also need a deterrent down the line, especially if the security situation of South Africa continued to deteriorate. So that contention, of course, is debatable, but when one considers the significant geostrategic changes in Southern Africa from the mid-1970s and Pretoria's perception of a communist takeover of the region, it might hold some truth. So just very quickly a little bit of history about what happened in in Southern Africa in the mid-1970s. So South Africa to the east borders Mozambique. To the west it had Southwest Africa, and to the north of Southwest Africa was Angola. So both Angola and Mozambique were Portuguese colonies. So in 1974 there was a coup in Portugal. Eventually there were civil wars that broke out in both Mozambique and in Angola. And in both of those states communist-orientated governments were put in power. And specifically in Angola, which was like literally on the border with South Africa, and South Africa's occupied Namibia, the Cubans started supporting, there was a civil war that broke out and South Africa became involved in what was called the border war. So for them it was this perceived threat of communism overrunning South Africa. And so it's a border war that broke out in 1975 that would go on until 1989. And that was one of the big reasons why South Africa wanted to develop a nuclear deterrent. Okay, the formal decision to develop a nuclear deterrent was taken in 1978. And from there, the cat and mouse game with regards to the NPT became even more intense. South Africa developed its first device by 1979. It wasn't a deliverable device. The first deliverable device was basically around about 1982. But yeah, it was only meant as a deterrent and not meant as an offensive weapon to use in any of the situations that they were in conflict. So what are the lessons I will need to start wrapping up? So there are certain lessons that one can learn from, okay, that one. I'm not sure what is going on with my PowerPoint today because it's not linked to my laptop. Okay, so South Africa originally had a commitment to non-proliferation norms. Basically, what are the lessons that we can learn from the South African case? So South Africa originally had a commitment to non-proliferation norms. It had complied, as I explained, with early international non-proliferation norms. It supported the emergence of a global non-proliferation order. I mentioned that it was a founding member of the IAEA. I mentioned the voting in the UN General Assembly. So basically, South Africa had a commitment to non-proliferation norms in the 60s, where its security situation had not deteriorated to the point that it did by 1975. The second one is that, as minority white nationalism consolidated in South Africa, it had the indirect effect of isolating the country. Probably all of you know about the apartheid government was a minority government. Just to give you an idea, in a population of 59 million in South Africa currently, there's only about 4 million whites. Okay, so it was very much an oppressive minority government, okay, that stayed in power through security apparatus, and oppression. So, as the minority white nationalism in South Africa then consolidated, it had an indirect effect of isolating the country. The decolonization after the Second World War in Africa accelerated, leading to the Afro-Asian bloc in the United Nations consistently, placing resolutions in the United Nations General Assembly against South Africa. By 1977, a mandatory arms embargo was introduced against South Africa. South Africa was kicked out of most international bodies. The isolation of the country became quite severe. So as this decolonization and the pressure increased, South Africa became quite a pariah amongst the nations. How did it react? It reacted through a crackdown on black opposition and the refusal to give up Southwest Africa, and that led to more international isolation. There is an argument that's saying that South Africa's search for international status and recognition became a driver for its development of the nuclear weapons program, and it's a statement that I very much agree to. Parallel to this, there was also the search for domestic security, especially in the early 1980s when the ANC accelerated its armed struggle against the apartheid government. The domestic security situation also deteriorated significantly. And all of this resulted in South Africa non-complying with the UN sanctions and provisions of the IAEA statute in terms of the nuclear facilities. Next one, number 3. Okay, so South African decision makers never questioned the morality of nuclear weapons. Morality wasn't a thing for them. Well, they were the apartheid government, so a lot of the things that they did was not moral. Okay, so morality wasn't a thing for them. They basically focused on immorality of interracial contact and relations, and what they termed the immorality of communism. And of course, the immorality of interracial contact. There were laws in South Africa prohibiting black South Africans and white South Africans from getting married and that sort of thing. So that is what they focused on. For them, that was immoral, but not what they were doing that was regarded as immoral. So nuclear weapons were regarded as instruments to maintain the white supremacy in South Africa, and that came out very strongly in a speech that P.W. Botha had when he opened the new nuclear facility in 1982. Okay, third one. I'm almost done. So the fourth one is no public domestic debate on South Africa's nuclear weapons program ever occurred. It was a very secretive program. It left the world wondering also about what the extent of the program was. The public debate in South Africa, and I remember this growing up in South Africa at the time, it basically focused on perceived threats against the government. The communist threat against the government was what they focused on, and the preservation of the white population. So the decisions on the nuclear program remained secret, and it remained the domain of the executive political establishment. A very small group of the political establishment that had insight into it, and it also remained secret within the nuclear scientific community and the military establishment. And again, not even the entire military establishment. It was literally a small group of only a few people. Okay, number 5 is South Africa, due to its international isolation, became quite a nuclear entrepreneur. It circumvented international sanctions and embargoes. I wrote my PhD on the 1977 arms embargo against South Africa and how South Africa managed to circumvent that until 1997. By 1984, they even became a country that exported arms. So they turned the mandatory arms embargo around to becoming not an importer of arms, but an exporter of arms by 1984. So they gained technological assistance and dual-use items from third countries, and Israel played a very big role there. France was also a bit involved. And they also developed unique science, nuclear science and technology. Number 6, almost there. So once the NPT was negotiated and entered into force, South Africa never formed international alliances against the provisions of the NPT. And they just decided that we will remain non-aligned, which was important because it was a nuclear weapon state by 1982. And they couldn't sign the NPT while being a nuclear weapon state. So for them, it was kind of like, let's follow this policy of opacity. The only exception was, of course, Israel, that was also non-aligned to the NPT, and there was a formal collaboration agreement signed between South Africa and Israel in 1975 in defense collaboration. It maintained relatively good nuclear-related relations with some states in terms of the civil users, and in particular France, which provided the reactors for Quebec, the nuclear power station. Second last slide. South Africa's suspicion of the purpose and implications of the NPT influenced its early and later positions on the treaty. I'm quoting, it was reluctant to surrender, almost irrevocably, long-held sovereign rights without having precise details of the implications. For them it was a fact of the NPT, is not good for South Africa's sovereignty, so it really, we should not adhere. So, coinciding with the consolidation of white nationalism and its perceived achievements, Pretoria was also intent on self-sufficiency, autonomy and independence from external actors. And again, that came out very, very strongly in the military endeavors in the 1980s. As I said, it perceived the NPT as a threat to its sovereignty, and it also wanted more guarantees in respect of the protection of overall nuclear technology to counter industrial espionage, and in particular the enrichment process that they had developed. Okay, to end off, and this will also link to what Robin will be sharing now. What's the overall lesson that we can take from South Africa's play with the NPT and its dismantling at the end of the 1980s is that when conditions change and the deterrent is no longer required, there must be the political will to dismantle the weapons. Now, there was kind of like a coup in the National Party in 1989, that basically the new incoming state president felt that nuclear weapons ain't gonna cut it anymore for South Africa. Secondly, international inspections must be allowed, which became, crucial after 1991 when we signed the NPT. And then thirdly, a country has to be totally transparent about the process of verification. So if you've got all of those in place, there's no reason why you shouldn't sign the NPT. That last point is becoming a bit contentious, because I believe that South Africa was not 100% totally transparent about the process of verification. After they signed the NPT and the IAEA started sending inspectors to South Africa, they only released limited information to the inspectors. It's only after the inspectors found some materials at the Walendaba plant where the enrichment was taking place that they were starting, to ask more questions. And that is when the apartheid government then basically revealed everything. And 1993 was the first time then that the world heard that South Africa had a nuclear weapons program. There's a lot I can say about the program, but this was on neutrality and non-alignment, so that's it from my side.
Thank you very much for your quite intriguing, interesting presentation. I found I feel like the lesson you provided might be quite useful to have further discussion on the nuclear armament and disarmament of the non-aligned countries. So let's move on to the second speaker. Second speaker will be Robin Moeser. He will also talk about the South African nuclear issue. Please.
Show the PowerPoint. Sorry.
I'm sorry for inconvenience.
for a second. Hello? Okay, thank you very much. This is too loud. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about the end of the South African nuclear weapons program, but more so about the accession to the NPT. And I focus on a very short time period, 88 to 91. And I think it's important because the whole region, 6 out of the 7 states that had not signed the NPT, acceded during just 2 years. So this changed the non-proliferation landscape tremendously. And important non-aligned members such as Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, they all signed the treaty. I look at a process of negotiations between South Africa and the depository powers of the NPT, UK, US and USSR, that took place during these 4 years in Vienna at the IAEA. And as we have heard from Anna-Mart earlier, the South African stance on nuclear non-proliferation norms and the NPT in particular was one of defiance and ambiguity over more than 2 decades. So it's all the more surprising that they finally turned around and signed the NPT. Still, little is known about this period, and for this talk and the paper I'm making use of archival research and interviews as part of my PhD research. Ultimately, and I hope to show this, this all culminated in the in the African nuclear weapons free zone, which is also known as the Treaty of Pelindaba, and this made the whole continent nuclear weapons free officially. Yeah, let me start by giving you the overview of what I'm intending to do. I think it's important to give you a broad overview of what happened in Southern Africa during these years. So as Anna-Mart already hinted to, there was a civil war in Angola and Mozambique, and the so-called border war between South African forces on the one hand, who also supported UNITA, an insurgent rebel movement of Angola, against Cuban and Angolan government troops. And in 1987, they reached sort of a military stalemate, and talks ensued, brokered by the US and the USSR, which led to the Angola-Namibia Accords in late '88. And this brought to an end a conflict for more than 15 years, and it resulted in the independence of Namibia, because South African forces had to withdraw from the territory, which was then still called Southwest Africa. But also Cuban troop withdrawal took place, so the whole region sort of stabilized. And parallel to this diplomatic negotiations ending the border war, there was a process that South African government officials requested, and they wanted to talk about the terms or conditions under which South Africa would finally accede to the NPT. So in August '88, quite parallel to these other negotiations ending the border war, talks took place in Vienna between South African officials, British officials, Americans and Soviet officials. And you can highlight this.
The computer is over here. I pointed at it.
But it worked.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
So these 4 talks, I'm going to highlight what was discussed and how the South African position changed. In '88 and '89, the '89 meeting was already under the new president, Willem de Klerk. The South Africans arrived in Vienna with an attitude, what is in it for us? What do we get for signing the NPT? And it's important to note that they never actually mentioned that they had nuclear weapons and they're going to dismantle them. They just did this part secretly at home between late '89 and mid-'90. They took the decision, and then 18 months later all the weapons, the 6.5, were dismantled. But yes, as I said, they arrived and they referred to NPT Article 4. They hope that they will resume the cooperation with the more advanced nuclear states for civil uses. And they did this because back home in South Africa, the de Klerk government, who put the country on a reform course to end apartheid and allow multi-party elections and unban the ANC and the Pan-African Congress, they faced fierce resistance from the right-wing spectrum. So maybe I should give you a little background. The National Party, who was instituting apartheid back in 1948, they were center-right, I would say. But there was even a party, the Conservative Party, to the right of the National Party, and they were really suspicious of the reform process initiated, and especially the right-wing circles were well connected to the military and to the security establishment. So the de Klerk government faced fierce resistance, and a step such as acceding to the NPT without reciprocal benefits would be seen as a sellout to the international community or succumbing to foreign pressures. So the de Klerk government was really hesitant to overrule these military and security people. So they needed actually something in return, and while in 88 and 89, during the first two meetings with the NPT depository powers, they were not able to extract something in terms of resumed cooperation. The Department of Foreign Affairs, who took the lead on the issue, tasked by President de Klerk, went back to the drawing board and revised the South African strategy in these talks with the depository powers, so to enable the break of this deadlock situation. So the new strategy, and this for the first time was made known to the depository powers in 1990, sort of put the whole region at the center. And now the South Africans argued if the frontline states, non-aligned movement members such as Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Angola, would sign the treaty in parallel or shortly after South Africa, this would enable the South African politicians to take this step themselves. So by making the region nuclear weapons free officially as part of an initiative brokered by South Africa, this would ease the domestic critics of the de Klerk government and thus allow the decision to accede to the NPT. But they went a step further. The South Africans requested the NPT depository powers to actually lobby in the capitals of the frontline states, in Lusaka, in Tanzania with President Nyerere, to convince them to sign the NPT or at least issue statements or declarations of intent that they were soon going to do so. At first, especially the Soviet members of these talks, they were hesitant to do such a step, and I think it's quite remarkable in 89-90 that the South Africans could formulate such conditions vis-à-vis the depository powers, but after a little while they agreed. And there are a couple of examples, I will just allude to them briefly. Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, Edward Shevardnadze, traveled to Southern Africa and did a trip to attend the Namibian independence celebrations. And he went on to Tanzania and Angola and spoke to the presidents and said, okay, please, if your country will sign the NPT or at least take a positive public stance on this, we might enable the South Africans to take the same step and change the whole non-proliferation landscape in Southern Africa. The same with Margaret Thatcher. She sent a letter to Kenneth Kaunda, the president of Zambia, and urging him to sign the NPT and lobby his fellow frontline states presidents to take the same step. And there are other examples. Hans Blix, former Director General of the IAEA, traveled to South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Namibia, did the same. So they all engaged in this short period of time to lobby the frontline states. And you could see this as ironic, because these states, they didn't have nuclear weapons. They were not required to give something up, but South Africa still had. But they requested the other governments to follow suit before they accede. Actually, to give you an idea, here, this is the map of Southern Africa, and some states, very small states like Lesotho and Swaziland, had already exceeded in what I call the first wave of accession after the treaty opened for signature in '68. But the majority of the states, Angola, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Tanzania, they did sign. Okay. I will briefly summarize the three main points of what I found in the archival records resulting from these discussions. And maybe here are also some lessons to be learned, but this is still ongoing research, so I'm a bit warning you not to take me word by word. The first thing I encountered was that after years of bilateral engagement of the South Africans with mostly the US, France and the IEA, they in '88 turned towards a multilateral strategy with the depository powers, and this mirrored the process that was ongoing in the other discussions to end the border war. But also the depository powers took this opportunity and jointly engaged with the South Africans because they thought they might be able to extract more from South Africa than when they lobby or talk with them individually. So there was a real coordination in their approaches vis-à-vis South Africa. And all the time, you remember the timeline I gave you, the 4 meetings, the depository powers met before. There was also always a meeting with the UK and the US, and afterwards, after having met the South Africans, they met again to compare notes, to discuss what was happening and how to proceed. The second point is, and the evidence in the archival material is striking, one cannot stress too much how cautiously the South African government deliberated the decision to sign the NPT with regard to domestic politics. And while the decision to dismantle the actual 6.5 nuclear weapons was taken by de Klerk's government rather swift and in secrecy, it took them more than 2.5 years to finally take the decision to sign the NPT. Indeed, de Klerk, 2 weeks after he was elected in September '89, called in a meeting with military leaders, director generals of the concerned departments, Mineral and Energy Affairs, Foreign Affairs, Defense, and let them know that his vision for his country is to dismantle the nuclear weapons. And another month later, he officially took the decision, and then in early '90, the instructions were out to terminate the program. On the other hand, the decision to sign the treaty involved much more media attention because South Africa had been defying the treaty for years, and then suddenly turn around would have been a huge thing. So they were actually hesitant to do so. And concerning this right-wing pressure, I think the US diplomats, they knew what was going on. And I have a quote I would like to read out. Before de Klerk visited Washington in September '90, Foreign Minister, Secretary of State James Baker wrote to Bush Sr. about the South African NPT and reform process. The South African government needs help. President de Klerk has boldly initiated a program of reform and negotiations that has opened an historic opportunity for a peaceful end to apartheid. But he is paying the political price. The ruling National Party is steadily losing support while gaining neither respite from the violence that stokes white fears, nor tangible recognition from the international community. So I think this summarizes it quite good. The South Africans could not return empty-handed from these talks. And the last point I want to make is, and I touched on this already, how the South Africans were able to bring the depository powers to lobby on their behalf after years of being the bad guy with the frontline states in the South African region. And This never happened before, to my knowledge, but during this short window of opportunity, it did. Okay, and by way of concluding, I just want to show you this slide. Botswana, Swaziland, and Lesotho is what I referred earlier to as the first wave of accession to the NPT. But then Mozambique, 1st September 90 until Namibia signed in 92. This is exactly what the South African government envisioned. And in June 91, and in his speech, Foreign Minister Botha actually referred to the recent accessions of Tanzania and Zambia and said now the climate was good for us to accede, so we take this step. So it needed more and more frontline states to accede until the South African government did so. Yeah, I think that's it. Just one more point. In 1996, representatives of several African states met and signed the Treaty of Pelindaba, and it opened for signature, and in 2009, 13 years later, it was ratified when the 28th state deposited this instrument of ratification, and this officially made the whole continent nuclear weapons free and ended more than 3.5 decades of bringing the idea, because already in the 60s the OAU was circulating the idea of making the continent a nuclear weapons free zone. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. And then the last speaker will be Hassan Elbahtimy. Please go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. I hope it's on now. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to apologize for being late. There's something slightly ironic. I got up at 4 a.m. today, but managed to get late because I got lost. I think I took a tunnel and a bridge, both that didn't lead to here. Also went up and down a few hills. And then ended up using a different entrance to this building as well than the one I used yesterday. So I really apologize for coming in late. I'm going to talk today about Egypt's very early journey with the NPT. And before launching straight into how the NPT story sort of looks like from Egypt's side, I want to make some broader framing points about my argument. And my starting point is that there is a dominant narrative about the origins of the NPT. So, in a lot of cases, this is predominantly seen or perceived as something that came out from a US-Soviet pact, almost. And by that I mean it's something that came out from predominantly a bilateral superpower dynamic. So that's feature one. I would also say that a lot of the dominant arguments about the origins of the NPT traces us back to two geographical areas. Predominantly some worry about the multilateral nuclear forces in Europe and sort of responses to this. And in a lot of cases, a breakthrough on the NPT came about after that idea was shelved. So that's one thing. The other thing is fear about China. So these are also very dominant in the origins of the treaty. So I would say US-Soviet pact, the dominance of the multilateral forces in Europe, fears about China. But also in the terms of the drafting, it's usually sort of focused on the very latter phase of the NPT negotiations, basically when the US and the Soviet Union started to present a common draft. So basically from 66 onwards to 68 and then later on. So I would say these are some of the dominant features. They don't really reflect that well with this conference. We see a lot of diversity of opinions, but whenever I go to any conferences, the dominant literature will usually sort of tie all these three themes together. My argument that this is insufficient, that actually these three core pillars of the dominant narratives, although true, they are insufficient to explaining how we ended up with one of the most widely adhered to, accepted treaty in international practice. I would say that the NPT was more than just that. It was the product of ideas and advocacy and processes that were sometimes localized and regional, and other times global, and had longer historical provenance than the dominant narrative sort of provides. And my third flag is that actually by restoring agency, which is what I hope I'm trying to do with my intervention, and by that I mean the role of different countries, the different stories that came about with how different countries became part of the NPT and developed and sort of helped bring it about, that by restoring agency, we open up new spaces for thinking about responsibility and accountability for the global nuclear order. Still on the framing issue, I want to provide still some perspectives on what I perceive as a narrowing down. And I see this primarily as a focus of three different currents. One is that relate to the analytical lens. And here I basically want to say that both liberals and realists, when they address norms, they basically adopt a consequential logic and emphasize great powers. So they are really not interested in the stories like the one that I will provide about Egypt or other countries, because the focus there is really on power politics, defined narrowly as that between superpowers. On the other hand, you get constructivists who focus on ideas, which open up all sorts of different spaces. They adopt a constitutional, constitutive logic when it comes to norms. But interestingly, the literature on norms in the constructivist sense confines the agency normally to a certain narrow group of actors, particularly middle powers. And here, there's a clear example. The research that is being done on, for example, Norway and the UN security concept, for example. But not only middle powers of a certain, coming from certain regions, that is rather limited, but also some transnational NGOs. So I would argue that even though constructivists, with their focus of ideas, open new analytical spaces, this is actually not really operationalized, and it's actually also quite confined to where they look for agency. I would argue that both limit agency and ultimately provide a reductive hierarchical approach to power, which I think doesn't serve us well to understand the diversity of the story of the NPT. So I would say this is the first one. This analytical lens helps us sort of, not helps us, actually manage to narrow down the story of the NPT significantly. The second one is obviously one that relates to historical sources. The history of the NPT and actually the history of the Cold Wars predominantly comes from a US perspective, so we end up really getting a US dominant perspective, and that is because the sources are much more available and dominant in the literature. The third factor for that narrowing down, I would say, is some political convenience. I would say from 2016 there is a dominant story about the demise of arms control. We see the INF is in demise, a new START is going to expire, and with this comes a sort of like a nostalgia of the Cold War style arms control. And I would say that this will actually coinciding with the anniversary of the NPT, we're likely to see some advanced movement just to sort of emphasize areas of convergence between the US and Russia, US and Soviet Union, and perhaps in a way also get that story about how the NPT was a product of that and only just that. Okay. So this is when it comes to framing. When it comes to the story of Egypt and the NPT, I'll provide first a very brief snapshot of Egypt and the nuclear question. So Egypt never built nuclear weapons. Egypt thought about the possibility of having a nuclear weapons program, but never really invested sufficiently or took it seriously. It has currently 2 research reactors. One is quite old. As I mentioned, considered some nuclear options in the 50s and 60s, but did not pursue them seriously. It's a country that is embedded in networks of non-alignment and Afro-Asian solidarity. It was a member of all these groupings very early on. And currently has a very active, like if you go to any of the NPT review conferences or GrabCon meetings, I've been going to them since 2007, you can't feel but notice how it has a very prominent voice in global nuclear diplomacy. So they are actually quite proactive in nuclear diplomacy. So that's a quick snapshot. A country that has not developed, considered in the 50s and 60s, have certain profile of ties with Afro-Asian countries, and non-alignment, and heavily invested in nuclear diplomacy. So I would argue that Egypt actually was one of the key countries in the story of the NPT. Its story is rather complicated, but speaks to the broader dynamic of how all these different countries beyond just the US and the Soviet Union sort of approached the idea of a global nuclear order or a treaty to ban nuclear proliferation. So I would, going back to like 1955, and some have already mentioned that, like the Bandung conference, actually in the final declaration of that conference, there was a specific reference to nuclear disarmament and the prohibition of the production, experimentation, and use of nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. So the point that I'm trying to make here that these ideas actually, emerged in part also from other sort of contexts than we're used to, and beyond just the specific US, Russia, or Soviet Union. So that's from 1955. You get that in the final communique. Specifically from the early 60s, you start to see Egypt being very proactive. In 1964, they hosted 2 summits. One, the second NAM summit, and then the African summit. They were heavily involved in drafting the final declarations of both, and Egypt pushed for both of them to say something about nuclear proliferation and non-dissemination. So the African summit developed a declaration of the denuclearization of Africa. The final declaration also stated that all states, particularly those possessing nuclear weapons, were asked to conclude non-dissemination agreements. The NAM summit in Egypt sort of campaigned hard to get that in. The final declaration says the heads of state or government declare their own readiness not to produce, acquire, or test any nuclear weapons. So all these are just like ideas about urgency about getting some kind of like a global regulation of nuclear non-proliferation. Egypt from 1962 became part of the 18 Nations Disarming Committee. And then going back to the documents of that committee, you see very clearly that they were very proactive in calling for a treaty on non-proliferation quite early on. So from 1963, they called on an agreement to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, as well as information relative to their manufacture or use, directly or indirectly, bilaterally or multilaterally, to other states which at present do not possess them. In 1964, they made a specific proposal for a declaration on non-dissemination by nuclear weapon states. And again, we're most commonly associate non-proliferation as being pushed by like big powers in order to restrict the options for smaller powers. But here, the concern in Egypt was that the big powers who actually have nuclear technology can provide them to other non-nuclear weapon states, leading to more nuclear weapon states. So there was all that emphasis on non-dissemination and tying great powers not sort of like to use nuclear assistance as part of their statecraft almost. With the story of the NPT, it's just like surprising how like you find Egyptian fingers all over it. So you talked about the Irish resolution, and they were actually very supportive of that from the very beginning. The 1995 resolution that provided the principles for the negotiation of the treaty was presented as an Egyptian draft. From 1966, they pushed either within the ENDC or the First Committee to have a treaty as soon as possible. During negotiations of the NPT, they frequently called for a complete, effective, definitive, viable, lasting, clear and precise non-proliferation treaties that are coming with a clear set of objectives. They raised questions about proliferation loopholes, like the non-proliferation obligations are not enough. They wanted the treaty to be indefinite rather than 25 years limited. They wanted to restrict withdrawal, and always wanted to frame this as a global rather than regional, moving beyond just like a European scope of it. When the treaty was finally reached, an early draft, and then transferred to the first committee, Egypt nominated an Egyptian diplomat who actually presided over the first committee meetings that ended up considering the draft. They co-sponsored the UN resolution that considered the draft and voted for it. They signed the treaty on the very first day it was open for signature. I say it's a complicated story because despite all this, Egypt actually signed but didn't ratify, and this is tied to, in the Egyptian mind, the key dominant sort of dynamic there was fear about Israel going nuclear and trying to use this as leverage. I would say from the perhaps 63, a clear decision was taken in Egypt to try to, rather than go into a nuclear arms race, but actually to try to develop some leverage against Israel. And the Egyptian position only makes sense to me with regards to the NPT as a way to build leverage, in part as a way to build leverage to sort of like constrain Israeli options. Right, so I'm going to zoom out and tell you some of my conclusions about this long and complicated story that I hope it will come out in, as an article next year. And I go back to the framing question. I'm trying to use Egypt here as a case. With that, I will conclude that to understand the origin and trajectory of the NPT, you need to broaden the lens and see the treaty as an international rather than a strictly bilateral Cold War pact. It's important to also have different notions of agency. The role of other states is not just passive acceptance or inheritance or direct opposition to the treaty. No, they took part in formulating it. They had clear views about it as it developed. The NPT is a product of a lot of ideas of its age, and is partly inspired by long-standing anti-nuclear international advocacy. And this, in a way, explains the sense of ownership a lot of the Afro-Asian countries feel about the NPT now. There is frequently references to the NPT bargains, and I would say, like, I'm increasingly moving towards seeing these bargains as small and localized rather than like the big bargains that are associated with the treaty, or more informal bargains rather than the formal ones. And finally, broader conceptions of agency, actors, and what they can do, and the ideas that they bring to the process translates into opening up questions about the responsibility and accountability. So if we're asking questions about how did we end up there, we need to ask questions about how did each country sort of develop the rationale for contributing to the NPT, and it's not just the responsibility of the US and the Soviet Union. I would say this was a much bigger effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now that the all speakers completed each presentation, please, could we have some remark as a discussant?
Sure. Some thoughts and maybe some questions. Some thoughts and maybe some questions. It's a fascinating panel, and looking at this in the round. A number of points jumped out at me. Firstly, as far as I can see, nuclear reversal and shall we say nuclear abstention appears to be more possible when there are comprehensive regional security solutions based on the South African case, and you could also hypothesize that is the situation in relation to the Middle East, potentially in relation to the Korean Peninsula, was the situation in Europe. That's what the South Africans confirm that tendency or pattern. Maybe you can want to comment on that. The second point that emerged from what I can see is that nuclear weapons possessors, no matter how they acquire them through opaque means, covert means, enormous bargaining power at the end to set the terms of how they seek to finalise the regional security bargain. And that is an unpalatable fact. It actually rewards those who subvert the system. The third item that appeared quite important here, and perhaps may link to other cases, is the importance, as far as I can see it, of external coordination and commitment by major international actors, a unity of purpose, and an intensity to work to solve fundamental regional security issues. You saw that, for example, perhaps in the return of weapons from Ukraine to the former Soviet Union, a number of other cases. There had to be very active, labour-intensive negotiations. A fourth issue that emerged from my perspective, and it's probably more of a question. I'm somewhat quizzical about the role of FW de Klerk. It's very quickly, when he comes into power, that this occurs. Is that because of his personality or just political circumstances? Or did he have some personal moral issues with nuclear weapons? I don't know. It's just ignorance on my part. So, in a sense, I think regardless of all of these bigger regional security issues, individuals are important because they, in powerful positions, they make the ultimate decisions to change, whether it be Gaddafi in Libya or FW de Klerk in South Africa. And the last paper was fascinating, and I think I would as well, and I would underscore the importance of what you've said, that it's very important to appreciate the much wider international discourse that occurs. The NPT is not a product of great power politics. It's a zeitgeist, as far as I can see, at the time, which links a number of things together. Not only nuclear weapons, decolonization, development, which are all connected in some way in the minds of many. And therefore, I think you are correct. It's not a product of just simply the imposition of great power preferences or superpower preferences on most states. Otherwise, the NPT would not be so popular. There are many local and regional compromises, not just so-called grand bargain. And yeah, I have been somewhat perplexed by the role of Egypt. It was clear to me all along that Egypt in the 1960s and into the 1970s, Mohammed Sheikh, for example, were key players in this non-proliferation discussion. So I think that what you're doing is important. So there is no simple united narrative of the negotiation and implementation of the NPT, and to give that impression would do the NPT a disservice, and it's fundamentally a completely international treaty. And that's why it's managed to be so popular. It's imperfect, but that is also the source of its success. But those are just simply some observations. But maybe you want to, come back at some of those points to me and some else.
Right, thank you very much for your insightful remarks and questions. And from Anna, could you give us back your response? And then you too, and finally.
Okay, so yes, thank you very much. On FW de Klerk, and I'm sure Robin has his own insights on this, but F.W. de Klerk came in at a time when South Africa was really on its knees. So yes, he did have a bit of a charismatic personality in a way, but his predecessor P.W. Botha was the defense minister of South Africa from the mid-1970s, ultimately became the prime minister and then later the state president. He was very much a military man. He was very militant. He was also called in South Africa, his common nickname was the Big Crocodile. He was a very unpleasant man. Whereas F.W. de Klerk was more moderate. He also brought a more moderate approach into the leadership of the National Party. So I'm going to give you a quote of F.W. de Klerk, what he said in an interview on why did he give up nuclear weapons, and Robin also interviewed him, so he might want to add to this. But in his view, and I'm quoting, he believed that the nuclear deterrent had become not only superfluous, but in fact an obstacle to the development of South Africa's international relations. The world opinion had become increasingly opposed to nuclear weapons, and he hoped that joining the NPT would facilitate the international exchange of nuclear technology, which is not only important for the maintenance and further development of South Africa's own nuclear programs, but would also be to the benefit of its neighboring states and the international nuclear community. So that was from his side. There was a will and desire from his own personal side, as well as some other moderates within the National Party. P.W. Botha suffered a stroke in early 1989, and he was booked off for 6 weeks in hospital, and that was kind of like the opportunity that was created for the more moderate part of the National Party to step forward. In terms of other circumstances in South Africa at the time, it is important to just point out that F.W. de Klerk came in at a time when South Africa was literally on its knees. Robin pointed out the negotiations in 1988. So, through the settlement in Angola, the independence of Namibia, that perceived regional threat and the perceived communist run-over of Southern Africa disappeared. So it removed a major external security threat to South Africa. At the same time, South Africa was hit by international sanctions, unlike, I think, what the rest of the world has seen, in recent years. It was a comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986. Basically, every single country around the world introduced economic sanctions against South Africa. There was a mandatory arms embargo. The interest rates in the country was like 30%. The internal, condition in the country was also not good. Since 1986, there were states of emergency in the country. So it was just really, they couldn't afford continuing with the oppressive system of government that they have. I think on the moral side, F.W. de Klerk and a few of the other former apartheid leaders did talk about a moral decision to let go of nuclear weapons. I cannot say or not say that it was personally F.W. de Klerk's own moral conviction that made him to take the decision. Maybe, but I do know it's a confluence of quite a lot of circumstances that came together in South Africa in 1989, which is not particularly, it might not be the case in another country. In the case of Southern Africa, it was a confluence of that. It was very particular things that came together that ultimately led to the decision to dismantle, which might or might not be able to reciprocate in another country.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to comment on 2 points Mervyn raised. The first is the issue of de Klerk and the circumstances and his personality. One must also keep in mind that he was from a younger generation and considered to be part of the Verlichte wing, the more enlightened politician. And he was Minister for Mineral and Energy Affairs in the late 70s and was informed about the program. So he had more than a decade to make up his mind. And apparently he didn't like it from the start, considered it as a huge waste of money. But of course, this is what he said afterwards. So one has to be cautious with it. And some people argue that he had a Damascus moment and then suddenly turned around and considered nuclear weapons and apartheid as bad. But my argument is that he was more, he was not willing to give up power, and even when he started these disarmament talks, he focused more on a possible coalition in the first multi-party elections than of giving willy-nilly everything to the ANC. So the nuclear issue was, I think, before the actual transition and the talks about the future South Africa started. He wanted to have this resolved, not to be a stumbling block in the discussions. And the other issue you raised, I think it was your first point, correct me if I'm wrong, you said it's more likely to achieve something if there's a regional solution, right? Yes and no. Back then, in 89, 90, it seems like this, but in the 60s, when the OAU and I think also the General Assembly of the UN circulated the idea to stop testing and transporting nuclear weapons throughout Africa, the idea didn't manage to be put in practice. And then, of course, individual African states, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, had domestic ideas about how to use nuclear energy, and so this all, the Cold War hostilities came into play. So then the idea was not ripe, I would say. And finally then, towards the late 80s, against the backdrop of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, it materialized. And one last thing, and this goes back again to the clerk, he was for 6 or 7 months interim president. After the stroke of the old president that Anna-Mart mentioned, he was elected as NP party leader, but not yet president. He had to wait another 6, 7 months. And he already tasked the Department of Foreign Affairs in May, 3 months before the elections, to assert the idea of an African nuclear weapons free zone. So he was not even elected, of course, most likely to be elected, but he had then to come up with ideas how to implement this eventually. So he was, I think, in favor of the continental solution instead of just South African one. One very last point, I want to stress that this is now about the nuclear weapons free zone and the NPT accession. This has nothing, or it has to do, but it doesn't concern the decision to give up the nuclear weapons. This was taken, the decision, by maybe 10, 15 people. Only a very small committee who knew about it. And yeah, the NPT decision was on a different page, yet connected, because you cannot accede to a treaty with still having nukes. Okay.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I completely agree with your comments, Irvin. It's very difficult to write the history of the NPT without, for example, including the role of countries like Ireland, Sweden, Egypt, and key countries with strong international multilateral presence at the time. You can also not write the history of the NPT extension without the role of Canada, South Africa, really, really crucial. And the role of these countries tend to be edited out in the dominant narrative, and I think by doing that, we end up missing part of the picture. You mentioned Mohammed Checker, and in your presentation you also mentioned the 1965 resolution. I met Mohammed Checker several times. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. And he was there during the negotiations, officially was part of the delegation. Then he wrote his PhD on the negotiation of the NPT. And when I asked him about the 1965 resolution, the one that provided the principles for the treaty, he gave me a bit of insight about how that came about, and it was what would later become the Egyptian Foreign Minister, Ismail Fahmy, whose son has later become also a foreign minister, was at the delegation at the time. And he took inspiration from a set of principles that were put together by the US and the Soviet Union on arms control, and said, like, well, if they can agree some principles there, why don't we, as countries that are non-aligned or active in the UN, put some principles so that when we get into the negotiation, we at least have a benchmark sort of like to assess the NPT on. And funny enough, when Mohammed Shakir later on wrote his PhD on, this was his mindset. He went back to that resolution and used it actually as his methodology, saying, I'm going to assess the NPT outcome based on the principles that were agreed in that resolution. And that's actually the start of his like 2-volume massive book on the history of the NPT negotiation.
Apologies, there's something that I forgot to mention, just coming back to 1989 again. It's that overall in the NP there was this great desire to end apartheid. So many important members of the ruling National Party at the time believed that apartheid was unworkable and that a solution was needed to dismantle the system. But I want to point out that there was kind of like this tug of war between the political establishment and the military establishment, because Armscor, which is the Armaments Corporation of South Africa that was responsible for developing the devices, for building the devices, by 1988, 1989, they were still very much in favor of continuing with the nuclear weapons program. Armscor at the military establishment. So Armscor at that point was finishing a new set of nuclear weapons facilities, and it also initiated a long-term modernization program on the nuclear arsenal. So they were in the process of developing nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles and possibly increasing the total number of nuclear weapons as well. Whereas the Department of Foreign Affairs, in turn, so it's the military establishment versus the political establishment. The Department of Foreign Affairs argues against the continuation of the nuclear weapons program due to the heavy cost internationally. And in the end, it was F.W. de Klerk and the rest of the enlightened National Party that wanted to end apartheid and also started, of course, the negotiations for the release of Nelson Mandela.
Thank you very much. Speakers and discussant, I thought the morality issues, domestic, political dynamics, international relations, influence of superpowers, all of these, the personal initiatives, all of these issues are quite important, although it might be difficult to pinpoint the most decisive element that made possible to armament and disarmament. Well, now let us open up the floor for any question. Right. Okay. First gentleman and the second one.
Thank you. Egypt, since the mid-70s, was one of the initiator, and since then a very strong supporter of the nuclear weapon-free zone Middle East. The question is, of course, was it a moral norm or only leverage against Israel? So far, this initiative, supported by all the Arab states and Iran, didn't really go off the ground. It was topic of all the NPT review conferences, was a stumbling block at the last NPT review conference, and will be a stumbling block in the next year NPT review conference, because the US, Israel never will agree to it. And there is an alternative, however. So if this nuclear weapon-free zone disarmament is a norm for Egypt, there is the alternative, what we have heard, there is Pelindaba. So there is Pelindaba, and Egypt has signed but not ratified the Pelindaba Treaty. But if it is a norm, it could easily ratify and join the nuclear weapon-free zone Africa. So is it only leverage against Israel, or is it a norm? If it is a norm, it should join. And it will also could encourage, if it is a norm, Iran to join the nuclear weapon-free zone Semipalatinsk in the north. So only Israel would be the country which still supposed to have nuclear weapons. but there is a vast area of nuclear weapon-free zone from Mongolia to Africa, with the exception of Israel. If it is a norm, if it is only against Israel, it never will go off the ground.
Is this a question for Hassan? Or
primarily,
okay. Let me have two more questions. Okay, and then and you. Yeah. And later. Okay.
Great, thank you all. And I suppose my question is directed narrowly at Hassan, but it probably bears upon the presentations of Anna-Mart and Robin as well. And that's the importance of the centrality of the United Nations to this process. The ENDC is technically an autonomous committee, but it is one that is, I think, charged by UNGA statute to refer back any of its work to the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations General Assembly is really transformed over the course of the 1960s. I think, at least to my count, from the moment the Irish Resolution is first passed in 1961 to the moment the NPT is finalized and commended in 1968, 40 new nations, all of which are Afro-Asian, join the Assembly. The ENDC itself is emblematic of the growing stature of the neutrals, the non-aligned, but also this group of post-colonial nations in international governance. So would you, to make this more of a question and less of a soliloquy, in your research, how important, I suppose, is the legitimacy of the United Nations as a sort of parliament to the world in the eyes of these actors? How central was that for them? And relatedly, how important was it for them as representatives of their government to be seen as negotiating equals with their peers, especially from North American and Western, but also communist states? I know a number of you have conducted interviews with these officials. In my experience, it seems like they have sort of fostered a certain amount of personal responsibility and also identity in partaking in these momentous international negotiations. So how would you sort of respond to that dynamic, that social dynamic?
Thank you all for your presentations. I have a question about South Africa and about Egypt, if that's all right. I'll keep them both short. Robin, I think you mentioned that the South African delegation failed to secure the technological cooperation that they were seeking in the NPT accession talks. I was curious if you could say more about what the nature of that cooperation was that they were seeking and how it would differ from the cooperation they'd be guaranteed by virtue of becoming an NPT state. And then on Egypt, I was curious if you could speak to whether the 1956 Suez Crisis played any kind of role in affecting Egyptian thinking on whether to pursue nuclear weapons. I've heard some scholars claim that this was formative for French and Israeli advocates of pursuing nuclear weapons, so I was curious if the actual state that was invaded in the crisis also took the same kind of possible lesson.
All right, thank you very much. Could you answer from the South African team and then Hassan? Yeah, from the South African.
I first start with you, question, Leonard. The South Africans tried to obtain technological cooperation and the right to market their uranium unrestricted internationally. But the problem was, in each of the depository countries, there was still a domestic legislation prohibiting these things due to the sanctions in place. And for the US, for example, it was the CAAA, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, that they could not overcome. So they were actually, it was prevented by domestic legislation. And Article 4 of the NPT provides just that, the peaceful exchange of signatories, peaceful nuclear cooperation among signatories of the NPT. So even by the South Africans had doubt when they join, they will not get Article 4 in practice. Then I think the question by Jonathan, I would again, and very briefly, I think you can answer this much more detailed. It's again this gap between foreign affairs officials who care about these moral issues and be seen internationally as equals or partners, and the military establishment who just did not care. And this was for years a characteristic of the South African foreign service vis-à-vis the military leaders. And the foreign affairs officials were at pains to actually achieve something and could only go so far, whereas the military leaders were more focused on the immediate security situation in the region, and they did not attend meetings in Vienna. And the South Africans were banned from almost all international organizations, and just the IEA, they lost the seat in the Board of Governors in the late 70s and were short of losing the membership right in the late 80s. And foreign affairs officials cared, but the head of the Atomic Energy Agency in South Africa, he said, we don't have exchanges anyway, so I don't care. We don't need new nuclear installations until the early 2000s. So we can also have our membership revoked.
Okay, so I'll focus on Jonathan's question and just flip it over in terms of, the role of the Afro-Asian nations. The decolonized bloc in the United Nations was immensely important for the pressure against South Africa, but it was also very frustrating for those decolonized states. So in the 1960s, from the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, especially after the banning of the ANC and the PAC, the Communist Party and so on, they became very vocal in the United Nations. So it's one resolution after the other, that they brought before the United Nations, and particularly led by India, but also, by more and more African states. Now, there were two cases where they were particularly frustrated with the big powers in the United Nations. First time in 1963, already in 1963, this Afro-Asian bloc, and this comes to the question of the legitimacy. How legitimate did they feel themselves in the UN? So they wanted South Africa to be declared a threat against international peace under Chapter 7 of the UN. And it was consistently the United States that blocked more severe measures being introduced against South Africa. And this frustrated the non-aligned movement, in particular, as they were represented in the UN. So it was a very watered-down arms embargo that was introduced against South Africa in '63 that didn't even mention nuclear. Okay. So it was also a voluntary arms embargo. So they did, in fact, they were able to bring South Africa before the International Court of Justice. For the first time in South Africa won the case, and then they appealed, and it went there for a second time and dragged out for several years. Fast forward to 1977, the voice of this Afro-Asian bloc had become deafening. And it was also the British anti-apartheid movement that was led by a South African in exile, Abdul Minty, who tried to bring more severe measures against South Africa. So in '77, they were able to get South Africa declared as a threat to international peace. And that then led to the mandatory arms embargo against South Africa being introduced. So yeah, you see a lot of interplay there, but again, they wanted more severe sanctions. And again, it was the United States that stepped in and said, okay, we can't really go to that extent, so let's focus just on an arms embargo. So there was a lot of frustration between kind of the Western powers in the UN versus the non-aligned movement versus the Afro-Asian bloc, that were really wanted. At one point, I even saw a document where they wanted the UN to militarily intervene in South Africa. So yeah, it's an interesting interplay that.
So a few questions. The first, I think you want me to address like whether that is like norm in broad sense or kind of like leverage, and I think it's a combination of both, and I think it's difficult for it to be entirely one thing rather than the other. On the one hand, it's not kind of like a completely interest-free subscription to grandiose ideas about nuclear weapons and peace. Yes, I mean, some of that might transpire into principles, broad principles, but I think as a country that for a long period was obsessed when it comes to nuclear with what its neighbor is doing, that was always in the mind. So when I talk to sort of former officials, I mean, they were concerned with what Israel was doing. And the real question was, should Egypt try to follow suit? So the idea was, it was clear that they were going down that route. And should Egypt follow that or try to constrain that? And that was the real debate in Egypt. That said, Israel was not the only thing that Egypt was concerned about when it comes to nuclear. So tests in Algeria were a massive thing in Egypt, and they played a massive role in sort of to undermine France in the UN by sponsoring resolutions against French tests in Algeria. Campaign against apartheid South Africa nuclear, Egypt was also very much part of that as well. So yeah, so a broad set of kind of like policies on the nuclear. Obviously, I would say Israel was key, but others as well played part. The Pelindaba Treaty was opened for signature in Cairo, actually. So I think the Egyptians were keen to say, like, we agree with this. We want to be part of this, but we have an issue, and please sort that out so that we can be fully part of it. But I don't think we have anything in principle against that. Jonathan, you're absolutely right about the role of the transformations about the United Nations at that time. I think the 1960 General Assembly was a key moment in that trajectory. I think before that, like a significant number of Afro-Asian countries went in, and the UN session, General Assembly session in 1960, saw all sorts of different leaders descend on New York, sort of like rubbing shoulders against one another, feeling their power and influence. And to a large extent, all concepts about global governance are tied to that space, the UN, however imperfect it is, however grievances about veto powers and so on. This is the frame through which they all operated. And you'll see that a lot of the Afro-Asian countries and non-aligned countries send the best diplomats to the UN, right? It's they get a lot of it. They know that this is very important for them, and they invest a lot in it. And the debate there is always about democratizing that. Is about like how to make sure that that we are heard, and obviously the transformation from newly decolonized states, sort of like en masse flocking into the world stage. Keen on having a voice, so the optics of it was also really important, as well as the substance that that we are independent. And here comes the concept of neutrality. If we're independent, that the only sort of status that would make sense is for us to be actually neutral, because how would we be decolonized and newly independent while actually following one camp or the other? I mean, that was the thinking there, and I think it was very much grounded in the post-colonization experience. The Suez crisis had an interesting impact in Egypt. No, it didn't drive Egyptians to think we want nuclear weapons. I think, unlike in France and in Israel, which was a catalyst towards that, I think I've seen evidence that Nasser actually grew more skeptical about nuclear weapons after the Suez crisis. I mean, obviously the key factor there was the Soviet threat, right? So as part of the Suez crisis, Soviet Union made a threat that if the invading forces don't withdraw, then there will be like severe punishment. And it was just, I mean, there's a lot of historical work asking whether that was sincere or not. Did they come after it was very obvious that the US is actually against that and so on. But at the time, Nasser was also very skeptical about whether the Soviets were actually serious and considered actually using nuclear weapons. And he would go to the Soviet Union frequent steps and ask that question, were you actually serious about that threat? And then the Soviets would say yes, but Moeser was not convinced. But he worried that I think he excluded that nuclear weapons could have been used against any of the Western population centers. And his worry from that episode was if they were to be used tactically, they would be used around the Suez Canal on Egyptian territory. And that, I think, made him feel very kind of like uncomfortable. The idea that you lose control, you lose the power and ability to make decision about something that would take place on your territory, I think informed the attitude towards nuclear weapons and being part of nuclear pacts. And I think you see that very clearly as well in Egypt's attitude to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where one of the Egyptian criticism, was that actually Cuba let the Soviet Union almost run the show, unlike us in Suez, like we were running the show, not the Soviet Union was running the show. So that kind of like, you know, that nuclear weapon can actually mean that you lose control over your policy, because you'll have to follow another country, and then you have no leverage whatsoever. And he didn't want to see that happen at all.
Very much. And let me have other two questions, and you and Professor Iwama. And you first, and then.
I've got the microphone, so I'll go first. Is that okay?
Okay.
Yeah. I'm just reacting to what Malvin said about the strange nature of this treaty. That it's, what did you say? Incomplete? It is incomplete in '68 because you don't even know how you're going to verify. That's the strangest part of this treaty. You sign up, but this is only an intention of cooperation, and the actual work is going to be done by a verification. A verification process needs to be negotiated out. And then I looked at IAEA directors list, and I found that from '61 you have a Swedish Director General until '81, and after that you have another Swedish Director General. So who's in control here? You know, verification is the key, right? Unless we get a good verification process, we're not going to, or was didn't it really matter? I'm just throwing out questions, right? Who was in control of this process? I think the verification treaty with European Union and with Japan was very important. But was it the Swedes that were in control, or who was in control here?
Hello, good morning. My name is Cesar Rodriguez. I'm a PhD student from Osaka University in Japan. I had so many questions, but time is running short, so I'll just pick two very briefly short questions about South Africa to the two scholars on South Africa. So the first one relates to the nuclearization process, the decision of going nuclear back in the 70s. So as you mentioned, the decolonization of Angola and Mozambique and the rise of communist-oriented regimes in those territories was a momentous event for the rise of security incentives in Pretoria, specifically between late 1974 and early 1975, so still before the formal independence of these countries, something very critical started to happen. However, before the April 1974 coup in Portugal, the military situation in Angola was actually stabilized, safe. The rapid deterioration of regional security landscape was not foreseen at the time, before the revolution in Portugal. And still after the revolution in Portugal, the new president, General Spínola, he was not quite endorsing a pure and simple independence process as we turned out to be by late 1975. Furthermore, MPLA, who then became the single party in power in Angola, was the least powerful militarily, from the military point of view, was the weakest liberation movement in the territory. And Cuban and Soviet support only started to flow in late 1975. So it appears that it must have been a moment of serious reckoning during those 6 months, again between late 1974, early 1975, in which things all of the sudden started to look very good for South Africa. So my question is, what markers of nuclear proliferation intentions do you find exist on archives, for example, for that specific period? And secondly, what's the earliest evidence, hard evidence, that you can point us to on South Africans' intent to obtain nuclear weapons? Because obviously there is a debate about it. Very quickly, the second question is, so there's a lot of talk about denuclearization models these days, and South Africa is one of these ready-made formulas sometimes put forth alongside Libya. And my question is, what lessons of South Africa's denuclearization process would you say are exportable to other contemporary cases such as North Korea or Iran? Thank you.
It's very quick. Thank you. It's very quick regarding the military strategy of the South Africa. Such a secret, weapon program. If the military want to function the deterrence, there is a need to be some visibility aspect. Sending a signal to the potential adversary. So, what the military strategy of the South Africa? Such a secret program. How does it work? As a deterrence. That's my question.
Could you give a very brief question?
I want to ask about the African nuclear weapons free zone. The idea was raised in the 60s, then the proposal, the idea faded away and was raised again in the early 90s. The question is why wasn't on the table for 2 decades, the proposal for a nuclear weapons free zone in Africa, and which was the role of Egypt in the negotiation of the Indirect Treaty?
Okay, I'll try to make this quick. Right, Angola. Okay, so it wasn't the coup in Portugal per se, okay, that stressed the apartheid government out. It was, fast forward to when the MPLA actually took over as a government in Angola. And then the United States actually asked South Africa to go into Angola and approach Luanda, and I've got evidence of that in archival documents. It was the CIA that asked South Africa to go to Luanda to overthrow the MPLA there. That was 1975. So 74 per se, the coup, they would have looked at that, and was wondering what would happen to Angola and Mozambique. But I think they were hoping that more moderate governments would come in power there. So it's really only in 75 that Angola became a big concern for South Africa. The United States, the Congress found out that South Africa was literally a few hundred kilometers from Luanda, and they pulled the plug, on the American involvement and support to the South African troops. And the South African troops were stranded and had to backtrack back into Namibia. The earliest indications of South Africa wanting to go nuclear, as I said, by 1969, there was very definite plans to, develop a peaceful nuclear explosive, in the sense that, and I've had a long interview with what I call the father of the South African PNE device. At that point, it wasn't, didn't really have any ideas about going military with a device like that. Like the American Plowshare program, that were investigating using nuclear energy for deep harbors, for deep mining, for kind of like civil type projects is what they were looking at the end of the 60s. Of course, for a PNE, you also needed, the type of device is important, so you find that between 1972 and 1974, it was first theoretical investigations into a gun type device. And then in 1974 they tested a projectile that contained non-nuclear material to basically test the mechanism. And then in 74 there's indication of an underground test site. There's a decision to prepare an underground test site in the Kalahari Desert in South Africa, with the aim of testing, you know, a PNE and not a military device there. Now, I think a PNE is sometimes a smokescreen, you know, for the intention to develop a military capability. India is a good example. They tested the PNE in '74, and by '98 they had a fully developed military capability. 78 was literally the earliest evidence that I have where they talk about developing, you know, nuclear weapons as a deterrent. So to answer your question, sir, yes, I mean the majority of countries that develop nuclear weapons, with the exception of South Africa and then Israel, that everybody, you know, kind of like knows that Israel has got nuclear weapons, even though they've never admitted that. South Africa and Israel had a very, very close bond. So South Africa very much followed the Israeli, you know, policy of opacity, where they kind of like made suggestions that we might have a nuclear capability, you know, and then when they are asked more deep questions about that, they would say, oh no, but we haven't developed that, we've got the capability. So for them it was this thing of a bomb in the basement, you know, making people wonder, and especially the Cuban troops in Angola and some of the other so-called enemies of South Africa, making them wonder, does South Africa have a nuclear weapon or don't they? So that was a policy of ambiguity. They had a three-phase strategy. I am looking at new documents that might suggest something different, but the documents that I currently have point to a three-phase strategy that was developed. Should the threat against South Africa become so big, you know, that they feel that they need to demonstrate their capability, they were hoping that they could use the bomb as a bargaining tool to get the United States and other Western nations to come to their rescue in case the threat became too big. So the three-phase strategy was basically, if the threat against South Africa became overwhelming, they would first notify the United States and other Western nations, but specifically the US, that South Africa have a nuclear weapons capability. If no assistance is forthcoming, they would go to level 2, which would be that we can demonstrate that we have a nuclear weapons capability. And if that didn't work, they would actually go to the third phase, which would be actually test exploding a nuclear device then at the testing site in the Kalahari. So that was basically the strategy. It was never meant as an offensive weapon. It was basically just meant as a demonstration device. And that is where the visibility would come in. But up until that point, the secrecy around that was really so that it could be used as basically a bomb in the basement.
I am very sorry, but I need to ask the two presenters to put their answers into one sentence. And then the rest of the answer will go to the coffee break, but one sentence.
To you, one sentence is hard. This was exactly about what do we expect from safeguards. This was exactly the argument the South Africans employed vis-à-vis the Carter administration and throughout the whole 70s. They said we need first to learn about safeguards and what does it entail, because we fear that our unique enrichment process might leak to, or industrial espionage will happen. So tell us more. And by this they gained a lot of time and eventually broke off the talks with the Carter administration. But it was exactly that point that they used to not sign.
This was with Americans.
With the Americans and with the IAEA, sorry. But the Americans under Carter were pushing heavily to the South Africans to accede to the treaty, and they said, look, what do we expect from verification or safeguards? If we don't know this, there's no us signing.
Very good usage of commas, please.
So Pendaba, so it was open for signature in 1996. I think it became possible after South Africa's denuclearization. So I don't think there is, so before that it was a pressure tool to get South Africa in, and then after that I don't think there is a lot of time between South Africa denuclearized and then the treaty opening for signature in 1996. Egyptian position, I haven't really looked into the negotiations of that, but I'm going to meet the lead negotiator in a workshop next month, so I'm going to ask him.
Just very quickly, Pelindaba means Okay, the word Pelindaba is an African word. It means we don't talk about this. So for me, it's very curious that because it's the military facility or the Pelindaba facility outside Pretoria was the the nuclear facility. So we don't talk about this. So it's peculiar that they're calling the treaty. We don't talk about this.
Yeah. Just come back to Yoko there. The comment on the incomplete treaty. Yes, I agree. It's an incomplete framework treaty based on constructive ambiguity, and it's always in the process of becoming. Otherwise, it couldn't have been negotiated in the first place.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I guess we can continue other 2 or 3 discussions, 2 hours discussion. I'm sorry, we are running out of time. So thank you very much for your lively discussion and active participation. And give a round of applause to the panelists. Thank you.